Hi, my name is Bryce Covert. I'm editor of the Roosevelt Institute's New Deal 2.0 blog. This is the latest episode of the Roosevelt Institute's Fireside Chats, our weekly blogging head show that explores the issues that are important to creating a New Deal for the 21st century. You can subscribe to our program through RSS, iTunes, and email on the Fireside Chats homepage. I'm very excited to be joined today by Derek Thompson. And Derek, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, I'm Derek Thompson. I'm the business editor at The Atlantic.
Great. So Derek and I today are going to be talking a lot about women in the economy generally, as well as specifically topics like whatever happened to the mancession, the great strides women have made in the economy here at home, as well as around the world, and also some of the obstacles that women still tend to face for economic equality. So Derek, I thought it would be good to start out with something that feels still pretty timely, which is to discuss the mancession and just to sort of catch up on, what happened and where it's gone and where we stand now that we're, in a recovery period. Do you want to start out with a little bit of an overview?
Sure, absolutely. One way that we've thought about it here on the business team at The Atlantic is to say that the recession was sexist and so is the recovery. The idea is that because the recession began in the housing sector, which is male-dominated with construction and other industries that are in the larger real estate sector, the male recession began earlier than the actual recession, and it was deeper. Men lost more jobs than women as the economy was contracting. But then when the economy came back, the recovery was also sexist. Men won back their jobs faster, largely because female-dominated industries like education and local government were slow to grow and, in fact, contracted in lots of places, partly because the stimulus ran out. There was less money flowing towards supporting these programs, but the private sector was having its own sort of secular recovery that was benefiting men. And so that in 2011, we created 1.6 million jobs. That's not great, but it's a step forward. But more of those jobs went to men because of these restraints in economic growth, in education, and local government.
Right. Yeah, I actually really liked the framing of saying that both were sexist and sort of sexist towards one group or the other, depending on which period you're talking about. Because, you're right, it's been interesting to watch the recovery period and see that women, for a lot of the recovery, in fact, I would say most of it up until somewhat recently, women were losing jobs while men were gaining them back. And it's not like men have been having a really robust recovery either. It's been a pretty slow, painful recovery. But women started backsliding, and their unemployment rate is now higher than it was at the beginning of the recovery. It's the same as men's, which I think is interesting given that there was a lot, the mancession, I think that meme was built around men having a very high level compared to women, and now they're equalized.
Right, and there was that moment in 2010, I think it was, when there were as many women in the workplace as there were men. It was the first time in history that this had happened, and it won't be the last. One thing that I think should be said is that if you do believe in the power of education, as I do, and that the more you learn, the more you earn, and the more likely you are to be employed, there are lots of reasons to think that it's men and not women that should be fearing for their economic prospects in the next few years, in the next few decades.
Yeah, well, so I'd like to get into that because I think that you are actually more optimistic than I am.
Okay.
I read the great piece you did, I think it was on International Women's Day, that was sort of like an overview of women in the economy here and across the world and how far have we come, on various factors. And it seems like you're of the view, and of course you should speak for yourself, but it seems like you're of the view that given that women are, out earning men in degrees, they're in position in industries that are growing, that it seems like they're sort of on the cusp of maybe the tables are going to turn. Mm-hmm. And I tend to be a lot more pessimistic about it. Just to start out, first of all, the industries that they're in that are growing, I'm actually quite pessimistic about, not because the industries are growing, I think that's great, but the jobs that are there in the jobs that women have specifically, I think are actually not good jobs. This is something I think that has been coming up in the recovery overall for men and for women, that it seems like the economy is creating jobs that are service sector jobs, which tend to be low pay, low benefits, unstable. You don't know your schedule very far in advance, so it's hard to plan out your family life. And this kind of precarious work is starting to be the norm, and women tend to hold these jobs, have held these jobs for a while, these precarious, low-paid jobs. But, if that's where the growth is, I'm actually not sure that that's really a good sign for them or for anyone. So I'd love to hear sort of what you think about that.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to put the optimistic spin on this. I agree with you 100% that we're moving towards a service sector economy. There's no way around that. I mean, to take the long view, in 1900, 40% of American workers lived on farms. And in 1950, 40% of American workers worked in manufacturing. And today, 2000, 2010, 2012, 80 to 90% of all jobs are service sector. Even within manufacturing, a third of the jobs that the BLS characterizes as manufacturing are actually behind desks. We're a service sector economy, and there's no going back in all likelihood, even if we can continue this mini boomlet that we're having in manufacturing and the energy sector. But I do think that if you look at the correlation between education and employment and earnings, what you see largely, and this is for men and women, is that at every level, like I said, the more you learn, the more you earn. There is a higher unemployment rate and lower wages for just high school grads as opposed to college grads. It's even worse for people that don't graduate from college. People that have advanced degrees also see lower unemployment and higher wages. And so the fact that we know that women are going to school more, they're grabbing 60% of the degrees, both in the U.S. and in Europe, that's a really, really good sign for women. And, not even to get into the sort of psychological arguments about how the idea that women might have higher emotional intelligence, and that might help them in a service-based workforce. I don't know much about psychology, but I do think that, if professional and business services are going to be the bread and butter of the U.S. economy in the next 20, 30 years, that women have a huge advantage because more of them are going to school. And school, as far as we know, is just the best way to prepare people to not be unemployed and to have higher wages.
Right. Well, so I would definitely agree with you that school is really important, and it bodes very well that women are getting so many degrees and seem. I don't know psychology either, and I tend to be wary of blanket statements like women are better at communication and men just have to work with their hands. Like I think that tends to be a little bit simplified, but still, even if getting education for whatever reason is a really good sign. But to go back to my Debbie Downer, which I feel like I'm constantly playing, you still see, and I think you pointed to this data too, that even when women are earning these degrees at every education level, they're still making less than men. And it actually gets worse the more degrees they get. You get up to business degrees or law degrees or doctorates, and it just the gap widens and widens. And I think I'm wondering, it doesn't have to be that way, right? I mean, it shouldn't be that way. And if it weren't, then I think that I would be really excited about the fact that women are getting more education and perhaps more nervous for men. But the fact that they get a degree and then they just seem to earn more, I don't know that I'm convinced that whatever is making that happen is set to change.
Sure. No, I mean, there's a lot to pick on here. You're right, and I'm looking at that graph right now on my computer. For every single degree, at every level of education, associate degree, bachelor degree, advanced degree, women are under-earning men. And I think when Reuters or Bloomberg did that study, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago, where they looked at all these occupations, and of 270 some occupations, they found that only in one, when you normalize for education and age, did you find that women were out-earning men, and it was something like it was like butlers or shoe shiners. It was some extremely esoteric thing. That's definitely not good news. One interesting fact to sort of complicate the picture that I found in this report on International Women's Day was this idea that a lot of degrees with lower than average pay are dominated by women, and a lot of degrees with higher than average pay are dominated by men. And this might be correlative, it might be causation. I don't know. But the stat is, in 2009, women accounted for 80% of education degrees, 60% of natural science degrees, but only 40% of business degrees, and only 20% of computer engineering degrees. And so there are degrees that seem to correlate with higher earnings, higher wages, that men are taking more of the degree, are dominating. Such as sort of an interesting, possibly just correlative stat. I will say that if you take the global view and the long view, and you say, in 1920, there were still laws preventing women from voting. In 1970, only 40% of working age women were in the workforce, and now it's 60%. And you look across the world, and you see all these legal barriers to getting women into the workforce. The U.S. has made so many incredible strides, legally, culturally, economically, for women. In fact, I think the rise of the working woman is probably the greatest economic triumph of the last half of the 20th century. I think that these are reasons to feel optimistic, to feel the momentum, and to think that if the barriers right now to women earning the same as men are cultural in nature, that culture can change, and it changes slowly. But as the U.S. maybe emulates places in Northern Europe that have adopted paternity leave laws and other small things in culture begin to be tweaked, I do think that there's reason to think that women, especially out graduating men in a service economy, have a really, really good shot at seeing these wages normalized, by degree and by education.
Suggesting that we should emulate Europe, that's dangerous territory, Derek.
Yeah, I know, right. Exactly.
Socialism. No, I'm just kidding. No, I definitely agree. I mean, I think that, I think I'm just personally torn. It's an interesting time because there's a lot to celebrate, and the change has been so fast and so dramatic. I mean, you pointed out that in 1920, or pre-1920, women couldn't vote. And now we even hit a point not that much longer in the long scheme of things where women were half of the labor force.
Right.
That's incredible. And I'm excited about it. I think what I worry about is assuming that this is just a trajectory we're on, right? That things are going well, all the signs point towards positive, and if we just sort of let things play out, then equality will be reached, which is not what you're saying, but I think that that's where that's the rabbit hole people can go down. For example, there's this new book, The Richer Sex, out by Liza Mundy, and I feel very conflicted about it because I think that a lot of the stuff that she's pointing out is really interesting and really exciting. That women are 40% of the breadwinners in our country, or equal earners, and there are some very specific studies showing women out-earning men, like young, childless, urban women, which is kind of a funny slice, but all of that is really historic, but then to sort of, she seems to say that we're on this course towards this role reversal where women are going to earn more and men are going to earn less, and are men going to have to stay home, and are women going to be out in the workforce. And I'm sort of like, I don't know if we can really go there yet. Like, I don't know that that's the inevitability. And you point out, if we were to adopt more European-like work-family policies, I agree. I think that would be huge in terms of tackling the gender wage gap, but I don't. I'm very pessimistic that that's going to happen, and I think it's less likely to happen if there's an overall assumption that women have either reached equality or just sort of around the corner from it, which is sort of the simplistic, easy take that some people have been taking.
Totally right, and I definitely don't want my optimism to be construed as complacency. Not that that's what you were doing, but certainly for viewers and listeners. At the same time, I do think that it's interesting to hear about some of these stories. I think it was a Reuters story about how high-earning women, highly educated, high-earning women who marry high-earning men. Once the men reach a certain income level, if it's $700,000 a year, $1 million a year, there's an observable tendency of their wives to drop out of the labor force. And I was really conflicted when I read the article, because on the one hand, I was thinking these are really highly productive people that are choosing not to work just because their spouse is doing a really good job in the office. And that's not actually necessarily a good ingredient for a highly productive economy, but it is a perfectly reasonable choice, I suppose, that one can make for a family.
Right.
And I think that one thing that we might see is that no country's been this affluent for this long as the United States, and people who have the freedom to make certain choices about their lives aren't always going to make the kind of choices that we would expect them to make, or that the kind of choices that would benefit sort of long-term productivity.
Right.
And so it's going, I think, to be interesting to see what happens when women, at the low income level too, are way out graduating men, and in a lot of cases, I think the decline in the marriage rate is because women, single women have reached financial parity with men who don't graduate from high school. And they see much less reason to marry them for financial stability. It's going to be really interesting to see the kind of sort of family and emotional calculus these people make, as in the next few decades. And it might not necessarily be the kind of answers that we're most comfortable with. But we've never really gotten to this point where women have had this kind of economic and cultural equality with men.
Definitely. Yeah, I thought that study actually that you're pointing to is really interesting. And I actually got on the phone with one of the authors, and she gave me a little bit more info. I was really curious for that because I always assume that women, if they're, so quote unquote opting out, that they're opting out because of children.
Right.
And that study was sort of saying that it's not necessarily children. It's more correlated with whether or not the husband is making more money. And she pointed me to a bunch of other studies that are starting to show that the way children act on women and their choices about their careers may really be changing significantly, and that more and more women are going back into their jobs in pretty big numbers right after their children are born, and staying in when their children are young, and then later on is when they opt out. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of research on the why of that. There was one smaller study that looked at the fact that now that college admissions are so competitive, coupled with the notion that the college degree has so many economic multipliers in it, and it feels like a really good investment for parents, that parents were actually spending more childcare time on their children as teenagers, trying to help them get into college, which I thought was interesting. So that all of that may be, and all of those changes that I just described are happening in an even shorter period of time. That's since like the 70s and the 80s that's changed.
Right.
Because in the 70s it was sort of what you would expect. You have a child, you take time off for the child, and then you're much less likely when it's very young and in need of pretty intensive care before school age as well, that you'll drop out to take care of it. And that doesn't seem to be the case, but there seems to be other things going on later in life, which I find really fascinating. I think that what you're saying about this incredible change, women have, I would say, women have really sort of stepped up to the plate and just flooded the workforce and changed the face of the workforce. And I don't think we've completely dealt with that change, and I don't think the workforce has changed enough to accommodate them necessarily. And I think that gets back to sort of the European style work family policies that we just sort of haven't touched very much. I mean, we have some stuff, but it's pretty light compared to Europe and also other developing or developed nations.
Right. I mean, I totally agree with all of this, and I think that the difference between the U.S. and Europe and other countries is that other countries have legal barriers to gender equality, and most of the barriers I think that exist in Europe and the United States. Not that there are no legal barriers, there are no legal inequalities, but the most important barriers I think are cultural. If it's whether it's office sexism or just sort of office culture and the way that men deal with men in the office and women deal with women, the family choices and these sort of things that a more affluent society makes when they have the freedom to. Basically, once they've reached subsistence, once they have enough money to live, and they're making decisions based on welfare as opposed to scraping by based on economic necessity. These are things these are really unanswered questions. We really just got here being a moment when female worker participation rates are comparable to men. In the formal economy, we haven't been it before, and so it'll be interesting to see. I think over the next few decades, the kind of choices these families make, and how office culture changes once there are more female executives, and it'll be an interesting time.
Yeah, I wanted to. I mean, you just started touching on it, and it sounds like you think the biggest barrier is cultural. To talk about the barriers that women still face, given all these great strides they've made here and globally, and I think it probably changes depending on whether we're talking about the U.S. and whether we're talking about globally or in developing countries. But maybe starting out here, some of the uncovered ground in terms of getting the things that are still in the way of full economic equality. For you, is it mostly cultural?
Well, I don't think it's. The reason I say it's not legal is because I'm just not aware of any of major laws that stand in the way of women achieving economic parity with men, the same way that exists in other countries. And so if the most important barriers aren't legal, and I do think that more widespread paternity leave would be a huge boon, not only toward just being fair, but also potentially towards changing the culture, changing the expectations of families. But that's why I say that I don't know. I don't have the answer for why women seem to be lagging in earnings. And like you said, every single degree at every single level of education, something is clearly pervasive. But whether that thing is familial, whether it's based on decisions that women feel like they have to make for their families, whether it's office cultural, whether it's the fact that there's still widespread sexism that exists at the executive level or at the cubicle level, I don't know. But it certainly doesn't seem like it's biological, obviously, and I don't think it seems like it's legal, and I don't know what that leaves except for a cultural explanation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you're right that there are no legal barriers, sort of like laws on the books that say women can't do X, Y, Z or whatever, which we used to have. But I guess I would say that the barrier is still legal in the lack of laws that we need or bills that we need or policies that we need to both support women and men and sort of make the workplace catch up to where we are. I mean, I think the other interesting thing, beyond the fact that women have flooded the workforce and what that means for women, obviously this has an impact on everyone else and families. And many households now have two working parents, and that wasn't the case, in the 1950s. So right. What does that mean for, workplace policy? I think that we have only really tinkered around the edges of that, and some of this doesn't necessarily need to happen from the government, say. There's been interesting studies of some larger firms who have enacted work-family policies, and it actually is really beneficial to their bottom line because then you have happier, healthier, more productive workers who are less likely to miss time for whatever reason and to feel valued in their job. Right. Which is really important right. as an employer. You just sort of have to take that first step of, maybe it affects your bottom line a little bit to give people more time off or more flexible time. But that stuff, I think that the workplace still looks as if someone is home taking care of children, mm-hmm. but they're not.
Right.
You know? And I think the other flip side of that, obviously, is childcare, and we have, like, no childcare policies. I mean, we have childcare support, but it tends to miss middle-class families a lot because it tends to be targeted to low-income people. And even the policies that help low-income people are kind of threadbare and have been diminished in this economic period just because state and local budgets have been so crunched.
Right.
And, you know, you'd think if we were trying to get people back into work, we would be upping the support for the stuff that helps them get there, like childcare, and it's been the opposite. So I think that that's the stuff that I see as real barriers, as just we don't have the policies in place to deal with the way our workforce looks now, you know?
Right. No, I think that could be 100% true. You know, I don't know a whole lot about childcare law, and I'm sure that there are things that we can do, whether it's to be more like Northern Europe, or simply to be better than Northern Europe. Yeah, I'm sure that there are advances to be made there. At the same time, right, that's not going to change culture overnight, and that, you know, even if our sort of family expectations haven't changed much since 1950 or 1900, but the economics have changed because the dual earner household is a reality today in a way that it wasn't in 1950 or 1900. Then we're, you know, in a way living in a 2000 era economy, a 2000 era economic household with a 1950s culture. And that's sort of an interesting thing, I think, to think about. And the reason that I'm staying very broad and on the surface on the point is that, you know, being paid to write about economics, it's not as though I don't think about culture. It's just that having not been paid to write about culture, I don't think my ideas there are very good. So I'm going to be as broad and abstract as possible.
No, I think that's fair. And I mean, I think that it gets trickier. And you know, when I see studies about, you know, what are the reasons for the wage gap, I think there's almost always a section where it's like whatever percent unknown. And they're sort of like, we think it might be discrimination. We think it might be sexism. Is it women just choosing mommy tracks? Like, people just don't, that's a more touchy-feely, like you say, cultural aspect of it. I think we don't entirely know. And I think, I mean, the idea that we're in a post-sexist world is as absurd to me as the idea that we're in a post-racial world. You know, that's still with us very much. It's just perhaps more subtle and, you know, it's not on the books in legal form anymore.
Right. And one thing that I will say is just that, you know, if the concept of the dual earner household is only, you know, in terms of women's participation rate being over 50%, that idea is only 30 or so years old. So this concept of majority dual earner household is extremely young. And if you give another 50 years, another 30 years, or even 50 years, then you might see normalized this idea of the father saying, you know, my wife is doing a wonderful job at work. I'd rather stay at home with my kids. But we know for a fact that is not happening. And I remember this. I think it was this week in the New York Times Magazine. Tara Parker Pope had this column about how relaxed or happy men and women felt when essentially taking care of the kids, whether it meant buying toys for them, changing their diaper, washing their clothes. And for almost every single one of these variables, women reported a greater sense of relaxation or happiness. Does this mean that having two X chromosomes inherently makes changing a baby's diaper more pleasurable? No, that's almost certainly not what the answer is. It's conceivable, I guess, but it's unlikely. What's more likely is that there are expectations that shape the way that we derive happiness from all sorts of experiences, and that for the last 50, 60 years, however many years, women, even as they've been gaining parity in the workplace, still have an expectation to stay home more with the kids, and therefore having that expectation makes them happier doing that particular task.
Yeah, I think that's totally to the point. And yeah, to your point, I mean, God help me if I'm biologically more interested in changing a diaper than, you know, I don't know, watching Mad Men or something.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's complete socialization.
Right.
And you know, as these trends, I mean, so this is the part of Liza Mundy's book, The Richer Sex, that I think I probably agree with, which is that as these trends continue, which hopefully they do, although, that's where I tend to get a little more pessimistic, that culture will change with it. I mean, like you said, we've only had this model for a very short period of time, and hopefully, even just speaking personally, my mother was of the generation where women went into the workforce, and it was much more expected of them than it was of her mother. And from my perspective, my parents were equal earners, and I was taken care of by child care for a lot of my childhood. And that's just the way it was, for me, that's completely normal. That's the way families look. A lot of my friends' families were like that too. And that's a pretty profound change that for me, that's just how it was. And, the more that happens, the more it perpetuates itself, and for the next generation it's even more normal, and perhaps boys start to see it as normal too, and boys start to reevaluate their roles as well. So
right.
We'll just have to see how that plays out to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, my experience is really similar. When I was born, my mom out-earned my dad. She was a consultant, he was a lawyer. And today he's still working, and she's active in the community and involved in my school and on arts boards around the city, and is busy. But they're informal, and she doesn't formally work except on a freelance basis as a private consultant. This is one example, especially one personal example. That's not a policy or law make, but that was a personal decision that she made without pressure, and I'm sure that these sort of experiences happen all over the place. So yeah, I mean, like you said, and like we've said before, I think that it'll be interesting to see how another 30 years of dual earner households sort of changes expectations.
Definitely. I've got you talking lots about women in the economy. We talked about the mancession. I thought it might be great to wrap up just with the economy overall, because I know you do a lot of work just sort of overall economics. Talk about the period we're in, and get your thoughts on how's this recovery going, and beyond men and women faring better or worse. Are the signs to you positive for where we're heading? What still troubles you? Right.
Well, what's interesting is that for so long we had the jobless recovery. We had GDP recovering without jobs recovering. And now I think the greatest fear among economists is that the opposite is happening, that employment is a lagging indicator, and that we're seeing multiple consecutive months of 200,000 plus jobs, which is good, which means the jobs are growing faster than the population, and that's bringing the unemployment rate down. It's encouraging more people to go into the workforce, which means that we're becoming more productive as an economy. That's all fantastic news. But if it's happening at the same time that GDP is slowing, for whatever reason, potentially energy costs, it could be, a secular slowdown in manufacturing after its little boomlet. We don't know. I think it's a time for people to be cautiously optimistic. But we've been burned before. In the beginning of 2011, things were really looking up, and then the Middle East, Arab Spring, coincided with rising energy demand all over the world, and that plus some political wrangling in D.C. basically shocked the economy, so that job creation really slowed in the summer of 2011. It could happen again, but I think the sum up would be cautious optimism.
I think that's right. I would add one thing that's been troubling me, and just as a little plug, we actually have some research out today taking a look at public employee layoffs, because as we've been creating private sector jobs, and you mentioned this in the beginning because it relates to the to women and the recovery a bit, the public employee situation has been pretty bad. We've been cutting jobs there, and that's actually I think been dragging job creation overall pretty significantly. And that outlook to me is not great, because it seems that state and local budgets are just as tight as they've been. They're facing pretty bad futures for their budgets, and are looking at more rounds of cuts this year. And if more people are put back to work and tax revenues rise, hopefully that starts to stem it, but I think that there's also been a lot of damage done. And just like I said, to plug our work a little bit, the interesting thing that we found when we were looking at it, I mean, people often talk about sort of the public sector job loss being something that happened on Obama's watch, and it has. I mean, during his presidency, there's been some really significant, almost record-breaking job losses in the public sector, but it's actually concentrated it's mostly happening at the state level and the local level, and even you can sort of narrow it down even further to look at it's mostly happening in Republican-controlled states, particularly those that flipped in the midterms, so newly Republican control. And why that worries me is that even if we were to somehow convince Congress to pass more stimulus, which is a good question, but even if we were to get money to states, it's unclear if that's actually going to filter into public job creation, if this is sort of an ideologically driven task of narrowing down the public workforce for conservatives at the state level. And I think that will continue dragging the recovery, not to mention it'll continue hurting women as well as people of color who tend to be represented in those jobs. So I guess that's the thing that I see on the horizon. For me, that looks stormy.
It's interesting that you see that on the horizon. I tend to see the local and state cuts as having been concentrated in 2011 and slowing through 2012. Not that there won't be cuts, not that these there will be layoffs at the local and state level, but I do think there is evidence that these cuts are slowing down, and that as they slow down, like you said, we were losing 20,000 state and local jobs a month for a while in 2011. That's horrible. It's especially horrible when you're barely creating when that's basically 10% of monthly job creation. But I think we're getting to a point where those cuts are going to slow down. And if we continue to see, secular recoveries in professional and business services, in healthcare, if education stabilizes and begins to pick up, and then manufacturing and mining and the tradable industries also benefit from the rest of the world, which is growing much faster in the United States and the developed world. That these are reasons to be optimistic. I think the biggest reason to be pessimistic, even if you take Iran off the table, because I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen there, are energy costs, and that gasoline is sort of a natural tax on U.S. growth. When we're growing faster, we make up a large enough share of the global economy that we can, rise overall energy prices, and so the faster the developed world grows, the higher gas costs are, which means that it's a check on developed world growth. So that's something that I look out for. But again, I am cautiously optimistic that all of the domestic news in the U.S. economy seems to be quite good, beginning with the strength in the labor force. Right.
Great. All right, well, I think that's a good place to end, unless you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share.
Nope, no closing thoughts. That was great.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and as we'll be having another weekly Fireside Chats session next week with some more Roosevelt people. So, Derek, thank you so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great.